In this lesson, we'll learn how to utilize multiple projections for a single piece of geometry. Okay, great. So in this scene, I have a very simple piece of geometry. If I click on that, you can see it's all connected together. However, this simple piece of geometry is basically two primitive shapes. We have a sphere and then we have a cylinder. So it makes sense in this case to utilize at least two different projections. Now we know we have a cylindrical projection that we can use for maybe the bottom portion, and then we also have a spherical projection that we can utilize for the top portion. All we need to do is make sure we select just the portion that we want to project when we choose each. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go ahead and let's actually come over here to a side view. And I'm going to come over, right click and go into face selection. And I'm going to come in and select the faces that make up the sphere. Those guys right there. If we come back over to our split perspective and UV texture editor, you can kind of orbit around and see I just have those faces selected. So let's go ahead and do a spherical map here. We'll go ahead and simply pop one of those on. You can see our cage has been created. If we need to, we can grab this little square in the middle and scale that up a little so we can actually see that. Now we know with a spherical projection that we actually need to close this off in a couple places. You can see how big this UV that's created is. So let's go ahead and grab these red handles first and swing those together here. Now remember, what we've essentially done in closing those guys off is we've told Maya where we want that seam to be. That seam is going to be right here. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But I'm going to go ahead and grab this handle up here and we'll close off the top as well. So you can see that what we're left with in the UV texture editor more closely fits into that nice 0 to 1 space. All right, great. So we've created our first projection here. Let's go ahead and come over here and we'll go ahead and select all the faces that make up the cylinder next. So again, I'm going to go ahead and jump into my side view, kind of make sure we're in face selection mode. It looks like we are. I'm going to go ahead and select all these faces here, just like so. Now again, if we jump over here, we can sort of proof our selection. In this case, it's a pretty simple object, so it looks like I do have all the faces selected. And I'm going to come over to Create UVs, and we'll just do a quick cylindrical map. Again, if we need to, we can scale this guy up some. And first thing we want to do is go ahead and close that cylinder off. You can see how that's changing the UVs in the UV texture editor. Fantastic. So now we have a couple of different what is referred to as shells, and they're overlapping each other here inside the 0 to 1 space. Now if we don't see any texture yet on our mesh here inside the perspective view, let's go ahead and hit the 6 key on our keyboard, and that's going to turn on our hardware texturing so that we can see any kind of materials that have been applied to the geometry. And you can see we have a little bit of a problem here because the squares on the sphere, they're kind of squished. We want those to be square here on the sides. So let's go ahead and jump over to the UV texture editor just by tapping the space bar. And I'm going to right click and go to UV. Now, if we can, let's go ahead and select any of the UVs that we know make up the sphere. I'll just grab these guys right here. Now we can control, right click, and then go to shell. And you can see if I grab my move tool here, we'd have just the shell that makes up the sphere selected. So that's what Maya calls these patches of connected UVs. This is referred to as a shell. If we come over here and select our cylinder, this would be another shell. So the way I like to work here inside the UV texture editor is I like to work kind of all over the place and just kind of work in clusters of shells. So we know that this guy right here we need to make some changes to, because if we look here, our squares are squished. So let me just grab my scale tool and we'll maybe grab this green handle and start to compress that shell. And that's what's happening is we're basically sort of making this texture less distorted. Now at this point, we have a size discrepancy between the squares on the cylinder and the squares on the sphere. And that's another important conversation we need to have, because you want to make sure that the scale of your shells is appropriate in the sense that we want the texture to be scaled the same on both of these guys. So let me come over here, and I'll just simply select this shell here, and I want to scale him down. And you can see here how that's affecting the texture. Those little squares in the texture are getting larger. Fantastic. So that's pretty close. We can go ahead and grab this guy and maybe move him up and drop him into the 0 to 1 space somewhere. So looking here, we've got another opportunity to create a projection here. The top of this sphere, you can see it's really rather distorted. If we deselect that, you can see up here near the pole, we're starting to get some really heavy distortion in our texture. And even in this row of faces here, we have a little bit of kind of waviness to the edges of the squares, as well as some stretching of them. So let's go ahead and jump back to our 4-panel view so we can get to our side. And I'm going to come in here and make another face selection, and let's just grab maybe these guys here. Now if we need to, we can come over and sort of proof the faces that I've selected, and maybe we don't select quite that many. Let's come over here and deselect kind of this row. Fantastic. So you can see those faces, how they're selected right over here. And it would make sense to do yet another projection here to eliminate this distortion in our texture. So let's come up to Create UVs. We'll go to the options for a planar map. And we can, again, remember, do bounding box or best plane. Let's go ahead and select best plane. You'll see here that the axes disappear. Go ahead and project that. You can see it projects that what looks like along the y-axis. So now, again, we have a problem with the scale of this texture. Look at what happened here. Over in the UV texture editor, the shell that was created fills the 0 to 1 space. Well, that's way too big, so let's just scale him down. And I'm watching in the perspective view, kind of the scale of the texture, trying to get those matched up pretty closely, and that looks pretty good. All right, fantastic. So we've got 3 different shells here. Let me just jump back to the UV texture editor, and let's go ahead and select UV. Go to shell. We'll move this guy into position here. So now we obviously want all of these shells to fit comfortably within that 0 to 1 space, but we also want to make sure that we're maximizing that space. So we'll go ahead and use kind of the lower shell here as the baseline, and that fits pretty well. Probably scale it up just a hair more. Go ahead and scale that one more time here. Fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about seams to kind of wrap this up. I'm going to go to edge mode, and I'm going to come over here, and this is the cylinder right here. If I select this edge right here, notice what happens. This edge is selected, obviously, but so is this edge over here. This should be a visual cue that there's a seam right there. If I were to select one of these interior edges, you'll notice that no other edge anywhere gets selected. But when I select an edge on the outer edge of a shell, another edge somewhere else should be selected as well, because that's the edge that this edge connects to along that seam. So if we come over here and look in our perspective view, you can see where the seam is right here. There's the edge that's selected. So the same is going to work for the sphere. So if we select this edge right here, you can see that this little edge right here is shared right here over on this shell. So sometimes it makes sense to begin to combine shells. So if we came over here and selected, let's select these guys right here. Now it doesn't really matter that I have the interior shells selected, because really what's important is that all these edges right here are selected. So at this point we can begin to use some of the tools inside the UV texture editor to work with some of these guys. So if we wanted to come in and connect these edges right here to these selected edges down here, what we could do is we could sew them, and that's going to be this button right here. So if I were to do that, you'll notice here that it leaves the shells in their current position, and it connects those selected edges to their partners right down here. Now, obviously, this isn't going to be a good thing because we've basically created a lot of chaos inside of our UV texture editor in terms of these connected edges. So instead of doing it that way, what makes more sense is to use the button right next to that. Now, this one right here is to move and sew. So if we were to move and sew that guy, you can see here how it makes that connection between those edges. Now, you want to be really careful. It can be a good thing to begin to connect up some of your shells, just so you can eliminate seams in your textures. But by doing that, you may actually come in here and start to create some distortion. So you can see here, there's actually some distortion here along that edge where these two shells were connected. So instead of doing that, let's go ahead and leave those guys as separate shells. Now, if the seams don't match up, or maybe you decide, well, I don't like where this seam is and I want to move that guy, what we could do is let's just come in here and make a selection kind of like so. I'll go ahead and control click and deselect all the edges to the right and to the left. So I just have those edges that are all connected there selected. Maybe we want to cut this shell and separate this left portion from this right portion. Well, we could do that right up here with this little button that has the scissors on it. Or we can come over to polygons and choose to cut the UV edges. But it's easier for me. I just typically will use this button here. So now what we can do is come in and go to the shell. And if I go to move this guy, you can see we have now created a fourth shell just by making a cut along those selected edges. Now, we could come over here and maybe reattach that guy over here if we wanted to move the seam. If we don't, we should probably just kind of leave him over here and look at some ways that we can reconnect this guy. So let's go ahead and select these edges right over here. So you can see their partner edges were selected over here. Now to reconnect these guys, there's a couple of basic ways to do this. We can use this sew. And again, you can see here, it just basically moves the edges. And this is going to be a bad thing because changing the size of these areas right here is going to create some distortion over here inside the textures. So again, in this case, probably a better idea to move and sew. So if we move and sew, you can see that smaller shell comes over to the larger shell and they get reconnected. All right, fantastic. So in this lesson, we've learned how to use multiple projections for a single piece of geometry. Now, in the next lesson, I want to show you a very, very powerful tool here inside of the UV texture editor, and it's one that you're going to be using quite a lot.